Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Daniel Gordis is Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. He is the author of 13 books and the widely read blog and podcast, Israel from the Inside. I don't miss an episode, and I suggest you listen and subscribe if you haven't. Gordis' history of Israel, called Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, received the 2016 National Jewish Book Award as Book of the Year. Gordis' writing has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, Commentary Magazine, and Foreign Affairs. Gordis' next book, his newest book, which we're going to discuss today, is called Impossible Takes Longer. 75 years after its creation, has Israel fulfilled its founders' dreams? It was published in April 2023. Gordis and his wife live in Jerusalem. They have 3 married children and several grandchildren. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Abby. Great to be with you.
So this is quite a book, and obviously timed beyond your imagination.
Sure.
I want to just start with the subtitle of your book. 75 years after its creation, has Israel fulfilled its founders' dreams? That's a big question. How did you go about answering it?
Well, the first thing you have to do is ask yourself, what were the founders' dreams? In order to know whether a state was successful or not, you have to ask, why was the state created? And different states are created for different purposes. The United States was created as a universalist project, when in the course of human events. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, teeming masses yearning to breathe free. Israel is about the Jewish people. In the land, the Jewish people was born in the land of Israel.
And you draw the contrast. That's a particularistic.
Very, very about the Jews. There's a lot of non-Jewish citizens, but the state's about the Jews. So when you ask yourself, is the state a success? First thing you have to ask is, well, what was the state supposed to accomplish? And then you have to ask, well, how do you know that? I mean, are you going to look at Ben Gurion? Are you going to look at Jabotinsky? Are you going to look at Hara'am? Are you going to look at Bialik? I mean, are you going to look at a writer? Are you going to look at the Balfour Declaration? Are you going to look at the UN resolution? And I chose to take what is, I think, the first broad-based statement, and perhaps to this day the most important one, which is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was signed by religious and secular Jews. It was signed overwhelmingly by Ashkenazi Jews because very few Mizrahi Jews were part of that. But to whatever extent there was some heterogeneity in the leadership of the community then, it was signed by a wide array of people. And it's interesting that in 2023, when the protests in Tel Aviv began to take off, what did people do at these protests? They printed enormous copies, 3 meters by 10 meters. We're talking huge copies of the Declaration of Independence. They laid it on the street in Tel Aviv, and people lined up by the thousands to sign it in Sharpies. In other words, we also want to sign this. We are still saying that this is our statement. Now, ironically, the Declaration doesn't say anything about democracy. So it's a kind of an ironic step, but it just proves how widely held the Declaration is as a statement. So I chose the Declaration and then looked at piece by piece, how have we done relative to what we hoped for there.
Now, it's a great kind of baseline against which you sort of test all of the commitments or all of the promises of the state. But first, that document, is that something that you think every Israeli is really familiar with? They've read kind of from start to finish? Because I would say many American Jews have probably not read every word of the document. Your book actually forced me to kind of take that deep dive. So just in terms of the literacy about the document, what's the reality of that, you think?
Well, the reality is you're definitely right that most American Jews, even deeply committed, Zionist, passionately involved American Jews, haven't read it. I don't remember when the first time I read it was, but it was certainly when I was well into my adulthood. I mean, it was definitely not something that I read in day school or in any of my earlier experiences. How many Israelis have read it? I mean, they really should, because it's only 19 very short paragraphs. It would take them about 15 minutes. Probably very few. Probably very, very few, but maybe now a lot more than it was a year ago before Israel faced the whole judicial reform issue, which was brewing for a very long time. So most people haven't read it, but it's a fascinating document.
And you actually you take us back to its gestation, and just that the fact that it was written in 3 weeks was stunning. I mean,
it's really
give
unbelievable.
us a little bit of the story.
So there's a guy who's the head of what will become the Ministry of Justice, who comes to a very young lawyer named Mordechai Beham. Mordechai Beham was probably in his 30s. He'd been trained as a lawyer in England. His father was one of Tel Aviv's most senior, premier private attorneys. I mean, a very well-regarded attorney. But Beham had left his father's practice and had gone to work for what would become the government of Israel. It was the government of the Yishuv at that point. The Yishuv meaning the Jewish population in Palestine prior to sovereignty, prior to statehood. And he says to his family on the first or second day of Pesach, I have a problem. I've been assigned to write a Declaration of Independence for the new state. We're talking Pesach, so it's about 3 weeks before, as we know, May 14th. And I don't have any idea how to do it. And when you think about it, right, I mean, nobody goes to law school and learns how to write a Declaration of Independence. You get taught how to write a contract, how to write a will, how to write a deposition. Well, you don't get taught how to write a Declaration of Independence. And his family said, go across the street to Harry Davidovich. He'll help you out. Okay, who's Harry Davidovich? It's the most unbelievable story. Harry Davidovich grew up in Eastern Europe in a very Orthodox family in the traditional Eastern European world, broke with that world, moved to America, became an enormous Anglophile, just believed that America, or Americanophile, just believed that America was the greatest kind of society you could possibly imagine. He studied further at Columbia. Then he got rabbinic ordination at JTS. So ironically, he comes from this very Eastern European Orthodox world. Now, JTS was a very different Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the Academic Center of Conservative Judaism today, was a very, very different institution, but still, it's a pretty big leap, and he gets ordination there. Then, according to most accounts, he has yet another religious crisis, and he drops all of his religious belief except for one thing, that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Every other religious belief out the window, that he believed to his dying day, moves to Palestine. And he's living across the street from Mordechai Beham, and he is really a scholar, both of Judaica and of the American tradition, and he has a great library. So Mordechai Beham goes across the street to Harry Davidovich, and Harry Davidovich pulls a book off the shelf and says, well, this is the first thing you need to read. It's the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America by Thomas Jefferson. So Beham, that afternoon on Pesach, he copies it out. We actually have the piece of paper that he wrote. He copies it out in English, and then he starts to translate it and edit it into Hebrew, not for America, but for Israel. And then over the course of 3 weeks, it's going to go through several different iterations with several different groups or subcommittees.
And Ben-Gurion is kind of the final word.
Right, so Ben-Gurion is the final word on everything as long as Ben-Gurion is around. And he says on the night between May 13th and 14th, okay, we're very close, but we need a small committee to do some other edits. There were 2 other people who joined this committee. They didn't even show up. They were like, if Ben-Gurion wants to stay up all night long and edit it, he's welcome to. We can either watch him do it or sleep. He's not going to care what we think. So they just didn't even bother showing up. And he did the final craftsmanship, which actually changed it substantially, but it's a work of genius, what he did, and we might get to that. We'll see.
Well, let's just talk about the first line, because it was fascinating that you say there's essentially 2 inaccuracies. And that line is, the Jewish people was born in the land of Israel. Inaccurate. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. You say also inaccurate, and that it wasn't a mistake. That was an intentional kind of tweaking. So explain.
So let's explain what Ben-Gurion was up to, but let's just remember that in large measure, part of what's been at play in Israel ever since the get-go has been competing narratives of who we are and how we got where we are. And in 2023's massive judicial reform, at the end of the day we saw, wasn't really about judicial reform after a while. The genie was out of the bottle, and it was the Ashkenazi elites versus the Mizrahi second class as they perceived it. It was about paragraphs of the Supreme Court for a secular worldview as opposed to the power for people of the more religious worldview. There are these competing narratives of who are we as a Jewish people. Go back to the Declaration, but they continue to this very day. Now, Ben-Gurion says in the first line, Be'eretz Yisrael kama ama Yehudi. Jewish people's born in the land of Israel. Now, the first person to call the Jewish people a people is Pharaoh at the opening of the book of Exodus when they're slaves in Egypt.
Too many.
There are too many of them, but Hinei am b'nei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu. This people of Israel is too numerous for us. I'm worried. Then they start to drown the male children in the river. We know the story of Moses. But then throughout the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they will be called people, a people, many times by God, by Moses, and others. But they're never called a people before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's in Egypt. So by virtue of what does Ben-Gurion say the Jewish people was born in the land of Israel? Now, we're not going to go into all the detail, but to put it very, very quickly, the word he uses for born is kam, which means like to arise. And it's a play on words.
You spell that as K-A-M in your book.
K-A-M, yeah, in Hebrew would be kuf mem, but K-A-M in English. And there's a Hebrew word called komamiyut, which is really sort of untranslatable into English, but it sort of means to rise up, to stand with your spine straight, to feel like you matter. And for reasons that I won't go into right now, but it's clear that kam in the opening line of the Declaration and komamiyut are really in interplay with each other. So what is Ben Gurion really saying? He's saying it was in the land of Israel that the Jewish people was a people in any way that mattered for the first time, because that's where they were sovereign. And then he says basically that our religious heritage was formed in the land of Israel. That's also not 100% true, because if you go to any yeshiva today, what they're studying is the Babylonian Talmud, which is of course called the Babylonian Talmud because it's written in Babylonia. But he actually is talking really not so much about the Talmud, he's talking about the Bible. And he's talking about the Bible as a gift, which he says at the very end of that paragraph, a gift to all of humankind. And Ben Gurion would say, yeah, the Bible is the product of the Jews in the land of Israel. Where they were specifically when each word was written doesn't make any difference, but Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, all of that, the books of Samuel, the books of Kings, huge chunks of the Bible, both take place in and are written in the land of Israel. So that's why both of those are sort of inaccurate, but they cut to Ben Gurion's fundamental point. We are only a people worth being a people here.
So link it to, again, what you're testing in terms of whether Israel has realized its goals. How does that connect?
Well, Ben Gurion felt that he was not the first. What did the Zionists really want to do? Why did the Jews get into the state-making business? Why did Jews get into the political Zionism business, right? For 2,000 years, we'd prayed to go back to Palestine, but that was more or less good enough for us. When Leo Pinsker wrote his book, Auto-Emancipation, what does he mean by auto-emancipation? He means ourselves. We've been praying for 2,000 years for God to do it. God has not done a very admirable job of getting us out of the cesspool called Europe and bringing us back home. So auto-emancipation, we're going to do it ourselves. Now, why do the Jews want to go back there? Because they believed that there was something fundamentally dysfunctional, even sick, about the condition of the Jew in Europe. They were weak, they were afraid. Bialik writes all sorts of poems about weak Jewish men who watch all kinds of atrocities and then run and ask the rabbi, can I still be with my wife after this and that happened? And what Bialik's saying, really, that's what you're asking? I mean,
right.
Why don't
you basically stood idly by.
You stood idly by, and you're not looking at a human being, you're looking at a halachic question. That's not who she is. She's alive and she needs you to love her, not to ask the rabbi a question about her. There's this whole notion in Zionism, we're going to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. And we're going to do it by going home. So that's why it's so secular. So if the idea was to create a new Jew, now Israel now has, as we've seen of late, very many different competing visions of what that new Jew should be. There's a Haredi view, there's a Mizrahi religious traditional view.
But one other thing that unites the new Jew idea is that we're not going to be a victim anymore.
Correct. And we're going to speak in our own language, almost all of us. We're going to speak in a language that was moribund 150 years ago, but is now the native tongue of some 10 million people in the world. We are going to produce our own literature. We're going to be home. We're going to be the ones who determine our own destiny. We're going to determine who gets into our country and who doesn't get into our country. We're not going to be the ones living on the thin ice, hoping the invitation doesn't run out. The law of return says any Jew can come here as a citizen whenever she or he wants. It's become controversial because who counts as a Jew? But let's just take the fundamental idea. We're home. It's our language. It's our calendar. It's our school system. We'll defend ourselves. That was what the Jewish movement called Zionism was about. It was about recreating the Jew. And if what Ben Gurion was saying is that it was only in the land of Israel that the Jews lived in such a way that they merited being called a people, then I think if he could look at what we've got today, he would say, yeah, I mean, we have plenty of problems to be sure, but look at us. I mean, we're exact opposite of what we were in Europe in many respects. And he'd be proud.
And before we get to the problems, if you go roll back to Herzl, obviously pre-Holocaust, and his impulse is that still there needs to be a home, there needs to be a safe place. Why was Uganda even on the table if all of this pull to the ancestral land was already there? Like why for him was it kind of like, at least there'll be a territory?
It was a little episode at the end of his life, which I think he regretted very much. We'll come back to that in a second. But he was desperate.
You said it was his biggest mistake.
It was his biggest mistake, to be sure. He was a complicated guy. Children committed suicide, a whole story. I mean, very, very sad life. In a lot of ways, dies at the age of 40. He knows that he's working himself to death, and he just keeps doing it, and he dies in 1904. But in 1903, he brings this idea of Uganda. Now, it wasn't really in Uganda, it was in Sudan, but it was called the Ugandan Protectorate by the British, so it was called the Uganda Plan. Herzl is just desperate. He said, we can't stay here. Don't you guys see what's happening? It's just going to, who knows, in 1896 when he writes The Jewish State, or 1903 when he makes his proposal. I mean, nobody's heard of Adolf Hitler yet. Hitler's going to write Mein Kampf in 22 and 23. He's going to come to power 10 years later. 10 years after that is going to be the horror.
I just want to make clear to the viewers who don't know, The Jewish State was his kind of manifesto in a sense.
His book, right. And so, I mean, Herzl basically says, both in 1896 when he writes the book The Jewish State, in 1897 when he convenes the first Zionist Congress, and in 1903 when he proposes Uganda, we're desperate. You guys just don't see. The walls are closing in on us. The ceiling's coming down. We're about to be slaughtered. We have to get out of here. And because Palestine was under the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were no fans of the Jews, and the Jews had very little influence over the Ottomans, the British said, why do you need to go there? We'll give you a slice of land. And Herzl was so desperate, he said, okay, we can take that. We'll go there first, and then we'll go somewhere else. Now, it was the biggest mistake, I think, for at least two reasons. First of all, no people establishes a country in one place and then goes somewhere else. You don't transport countries. But much more than that. You and I have both had the same experience. I live in Israel, you live in the States, but we're the same in the following regard. We have these goosebump moments, right? We go to Israel and we're told this is where something happened. You're driving up the highway and you see an exit sign to a place that you recognize from the Bible. And you have this sort of chilled sense that says, my God, I'm home. Right? I'm home in a way that New York, Chicago, London, Berlin, those places can never be home, because my people's book of books talks about this exact place, and my car is just driving right by it now. Herzl didn't have enough of a Jewish upbringing to appreciate the degree to which that magnetic attraction was going to be ultimately what made Israel work. The Jews were never going to go to Uganda. First of all, Uganda, Sudan, was never going to be devoid of problems. There were people there too. So the idea that this was sort of, virgin territory that everybody that was ridiculous. And for that reason, the Zionist Congress, where he suggests this, splits apart into a huge battle. And Herzl leaves the Congress feeling, like I probably just killed the movement. Worse than failed. I killed my own movement. And then he dies. And he never gets to see the recovery of the dream or what it ultimately became.
The United Nations voted in November 1947 UN Resolution 181, otherwise known as the Partition Plan. Right. Tell me about that and why it failed.
The UN resolution passed on November 29, 1947, which declared there to be a Jewish state and there'd be an Arab state. Neither party was happy with it. The Arabs were very unhappy with it and rejected it outright. The Zionists were very unhappy with it and accepted it. Chaim Weizmann's famous line was, if they give us anything the size of a tablecloth or larger, we're going to take it. Like, we'll take whatever we can get, because there's that sense of desperation, which comes from Herzl. It's many years after Herzl, but it's still that same sense of desperation. Now, in a certain way, whatever Ben Gurion thought, and his colleagues, he was hardly alone in this, right? But whatever he thought about living next to another population, okay, this was at least, there were borders, there was an Arab state, there was a Jewish state. Not quite as simple as that, by the way, because the Arab state was going to be over 90% Arab. The Jewish state was going to be about 60-40, 55-45 Jewish, meaning that it wouldn't take a lot of immigration of Arabs into that Jewish state for it to be an Arab state. Ironically, if the Arabs had said yes in 1947, 1948, and not attacked, you and I probably wouldn't be having this conversation.
And there'd be two states.
There'd be one state, and it would be an Arab state. There'd be no Jewish state. We would have been overrun. But they made a terrible mistake.
You said the Jewish state's borders were almost indefensible.
They were indefensible. I mean, they met like this. And it's interesting, by the way, when they're talking about what should be in that very same Declaration of Independence, part of what they're trying to do in the Declaration is make the UN happy. Say to the UN, listen, we heard you very clearly. The UN resolution said there's going to be two states. We get that. The UN resolution said here's the map. We don't love the map, but okay. The UN resolution said we're going to be both states have to be democracies. Well, we've been a democracy ever since 1897 in the Zionist movement. Of course, we're going to be a democracy. And the UN said both countries have to pass constitutions, which is why we have this very strange line in the Declaration of Independence saying we're going to pass a constitution by October 1st, 1948. I mean, come on, we're in a war. Who's going to pass a constitution in 3.5 months? It was never going to happen, but it was a nod to the UN. Yes, we've heard you, and so on and so forth. So ironically, If the Arabs had not decided, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, 5 armies, one of them was from a country that did not even have a border with Israel. If they had not decided to try to attack, there would probably, I think, not be a Jewish state at this point. But they did decide to attack, and Ben-Gurion had very intently taken out a line in the declaration that said, and we accept the borders as outlined in the map of the UN. He said, no. He said, there's 2 scenarios here. One is we get wiped out, in which case it doesn't make any difference what we say. But if we don't get wiped out, it means we're going to win this war. And if we win the war, we're not going to stop at the lines of the UN. We're going to stop wherever the fighting stops. We're going to better our chances of surviving. And that's what everybody calls the 1967 lines, the pre-1967 lines, which are really the 1949 lines. So Zionists always understood that there was a population with which they were going to have to live. They were of different views. Ironically, Zev Jabotinsky, who was the father of revisionism, which becomes the father of, he's the teacher of Menachem Begin, who's the founder of Likud, which is basically Bibi Netanyahu. So there's a certain line, although Netanyahu is not exactly a direct descendant of that worldview. But it was Jabotinsky who said, stop being naive, stop saying that just because we're going to bring healthcare and we're going to bring better hygiene and roads and technology to Palestine, that they're going to embrace us. That's actually haughty and
unrealistic.
It's patronizing. They love their land as much as we love our land. So what we have to do, said Jabotinsky, is we're going to have an iron wall. That was his phrase. They have to know that every time they attack us, they hit an iron wall. And only after many years, when they realize there's no possibility of destroying us, are they finally going to accept our being here. On the other side of the extreme, where there were people like the Brit Shalom people who wanted to create one shared country. And a little bit further in, there were people who said, we don't want to have an iron wall. We want to negotiate with them, and we'll work something out where both populations can live together. But of course, that's the conundrum that still has Israel trapped 75 years later.
And you write, the single greatest disappointment of Israel's first 75 years is the fact that conflict endures. Israel's various wars and its enduring conflict with the Palestinians have exacted horrific costs on both sides. Israel's controlling the lives of another people is a moral morass that has, without question, calloused parts of Israeli society. Tell me about the calluses. How does that manifest itself? We clearly see it. But in your own words, in terms of, again, I know it's simplistic to say Israel's success or failure, but this is maybe something to be less proud of.
For sure. Not that we wanted it. I mean, everybody should remember, as we talk about whatever they want to call it, Israel's presence in the West Bank, Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria, the occupation, the liberation. I mean, the nomenclature matters a lot to people here.
Do you use the word occupation?
Yeah. I use the word occupation, first of all, because I'm trying to communicate with people, and that's what the world calls it. I also call it the West Bank. I get so many angry emails. Why would you possibly call it the West Bank when it's obviously Judea and Samaria? You don't believe in anything. I do, but that's the language the New York Times uses. That's the language that Bloomberg uses. That's the language that the Wall Street Journal uses. Come on, we're trying to have a conversation with people in terminology that they know.
You ever get attacked, Danny?
Oh, no, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? My wife says as long as half your hate mail comes from the left and half your hate mail comes from the right, you're probably okay, which is about pretty much how it works. Look, the controlling a population, well, I'll just say one other thing before. We're having this conversation as Israel is really exploring this whole very tense and painful issue of judicial reform, which is really, as we said before,
democratic soul.
And its democratic soul. I finished writing the book a year ago. If I was going to write the book right now, I would say that there's 2 major disappointments. It's the conflict and it's the internal division in Israel. I think I do talk a lot in the book about Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and I allude to many of these, but I don't think any of us foresaw the huge rip in Israeli society that was going to come more or less a year after I clicked send on the file, more or less. But let's go back to your question. Why is it callousing? Because I think to do many of the things that you have to do if you control that territory, you have to have calluses. You have to, in a certain way, if you're that 18-year-old or 19-year-old soldier and you're being sent into that house in the middle of the night because you think that there's weaponry in there or there's explosives in there, and many times, unfortunately, they find them. Or you have to stop the ambulance with the pregnant woman in it on the way to the hospital because you've gotten a tip-off that underneath the stretcher there's weapons. It happens all the time. But to stop that ambulance with a woman in labor who wants to get to the hospital like any woman in her right mind would want. And you're the 18, 19-year-old kid, and you have to stop it, and you have to go in, you got to search, and then you find what you find, or you go into the house, and 5 and 7 and 8-year-old kids are screaming in fright, and the mothers are terrified, and the fathers are doing whatever the father's doing. I mean, just imagine how that, we can imagine how it feels to them.
And are you positing that there's no way to do this better?
There's ways to do it better. Micha Goodman, in his really fabulous book, Catch 67.
But before you get to Catch, I know that book well, but just in terms of sort of basic dignity.
Right, so his point is you can shrink the conflict. You can remove checkpoints. You can build roads so Palestinians could go from this area to that area to that area without going through our checkpoints. Build a road, build bridges, build tunnels. There's ways of doing it. So there are ways of doing the conflict better. There's always a tension between decreasing your military presence and increasing the possibility of terror. And people who live out there, who are Jews, have a very different perspective on what that balance should be as opposed to you or me sitting here in New York City. But there are ways to do it better. Tragically, I don't think most Israelis think there's any way of ending it right now. There's no conversation in Israel about a two-state solution anytime in the near future, decades. I mean, we're very far from that.
And you say in your book that not only are Israelis not believing in it, but neither are Palestinians.
Correct.
I just want to read, even though this is long, just to your point in your book. The Palestinians deserve better lives than they have. They should be able to travel without going through checkpoints. They should not live in fear of Israeli searches. They should not feel that history has consigned them to a life of indignity. They deserve brighter futures than their leaders are making possible for them, and the work that Israelis are doing to shrink the conflict and improve the lives of Palestinians should continue and expand. By the same token, young Israelis should not have to do what they do or endure what they endure to keep their country safe. Young parents should not have to dread their children's being drafted almost from the moment that they are born. Young and not so young men should not have to continue to do reserve service, often into their 40s. Families should not have to run with their crying children into bomb shelters, as happens every few years when conflict with Gaza breaks out. Israelis should not live in constant fear of war. So here, I wanted to read all that because how much are you actually feeling like there are balanced interests on both sides, or do you feel like this, with a Jewish state, ultimately, Israeli security is always going to trump sort of Palestinian dignity?
Well, in an ideal world, they wouldn't be at odds. I mean, if we lived side by side, we might be best friends in the world. We might actually not like each other. Sometimes you like your neighbors, sometimes you don't like your neighbors. That's okay. If we just left each other alone, then Israeli security and Palestinian dignity wouldn't at all be conflicting ideals. They wouldn't be conflicting goods. As long as Palestinians continue the armed conflict against Israel, which polls show, Palestinian polls conducted by Palestinians, show that the majority of Palestinians favor some form of continued armed resistance, not about the West Bank, but about Israel's existence. That's the part that people need to understand. When they hear the chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they don't say that because it rhymes. They say it because they mean it. And Israelis understand that.
That means eliminating.
Right. And Israel in that regard is still fighting the same battle it was fighting in 1948, which is the war for its neighbors to accept its being there. So it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. I see the impact that it had on my own kids in the Army and my kids' friends in the Army. My kids are all older now. All my kids are in their 30s. But, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when my kids were serving, you see the tremendous toll that it takes, even on kids who, thankfully, I don't think had to kill anybody. And you see when I talk to my Palestinian colleagues and my Palestinian friends who I know through work or through journalism or whatever.
Or you've had on your podcast.
Or exactly. And I seek them out because that story also needs to be heard. It's very important to me to understand that their lives are also really not nearly as good as they need to be. What at the end of the day is going to have to happen, though, is the first thing. Time is not on our side, first of all. I think we can see in Israeli politics in general that time is not on the side of the center or the left.
In terms of what? Just the clock is ticking?
Clock is ticking, and the longer we go into this, the fewer Israelis are inclined to make serious accommodations with the Palestinians, because now the generation that's come of age is the generation they were children in 2000 to 2004 during the Second Intifada. Their earliest memories are of running to bomb shelters. Their earliest memories are buses blowing up. Their earliest memories are restaurants being blown to smithereens. When you go to the polling booth, that actually has something to do with it. And we've been in this situation, we captured that territory in '67. So we're now 57 years or something into it. It's a really long time. I mean, most Israelis, of course, have no memory of an Israel that didn't have the map that it has right now. So I fear the time is not on our side, which is why I wish that on both sides, but especially on the Palestinian side, we would see someone say, look, Egypt made peace, Jordan made peace, Bahrain made peace, the UAE made peace, Sudan made some sort of accommodation, Morocco has normalization. There's even rumors about Saudi Arabia. The world's going to leave us behind. Even the Arabs are going to leave us behind. Let's cut our losses and figure out a way of moving forward. So far, that's not what we hear. Mahmoud Abbas is a very old man. Who will replace him when he finally passes away? It's hard to know. It will be a huge opportunity for the Palestinians to change course. I'm not optimistic, but I'm very hopeful.
So for the American audience that's seeing this, I think it's important that they hear your kind of warning not to oversimplify the race conversation that we have here as an overlay onto the Palestinian-Israeli or Jewish tensions in Israel. And you say that making the analogies between black people in America and Arabs in Israel are unhelpful. Can you explain why?
Sure. First of all, historically, they're very unhelpful. In the following way, they're very unfair to, well, both sides, really. I mean, to say that African Americans, who were stolen and plundered and taken from Africa and brought to America in order to be slaves, and that's why they ended up in America, and they've been here for a very, very long time, but they're not what I guess one would call an indigenous population. They came completely against their will. They had no say in the matter, obviously, horrible human story. The Palestinians are one of the indigenous peoples of the Middle East. I think to talk about who was there first, us or them, when we're talking about a millennium and a half ago is kind of not useful anymore. But we're both indigenous people. So first of all, historically, it's just ridiculous. One group was really indigenous, and one group was stolen, killed, raped, brought across the ocean, enslaved. The historical parallels completely fall apart. But look, here's the other thing. African Americans not trying to destroy America. They're just not. African Americans want America to be.
Are you making a blanket statement about Palestinians wanting to destroy
No, but I'm
Israel?
saying that fundamentally, the Palestinian people in the PA and in Gaza are at war with Israel. They just are. So that's the policy of Hamas without question. That's the policy of Hezbollah without question. It's fundamentally the policy of the PA, even though they know not to say it so much in English and better to say it in Arabic. So I'm not making a blanket statement and saying that everybody is heterogeneous. I don't think the Palestinians that I've had on my podcast want to destroy Israel. Although I'll tell you something very interesting. So we have at Shalem College, one of our majors is a Middle East and Islamic Studies major. And all of our students, every single last one who majors in that, has to leave Shalem College speaking Arabic fluently. And they all do. It's really unbelievable how much you can learn a language if you sit and talk it. So we have these little pods all over campus where people have to spend a certain number of hours sitting and talking to a Palestinian, what we call native facilitator. They're usually East Jerusalem Palestinian graduate students at Hebrew University, and we pay them by the hour to sit and talk to the students. They can talk about how do you make spaghetti, they can talk about who does the floors in your house to, who takes care of the children, whatever. One day a student comes to me and says, I have a meeting with so-and-so for many months. She's really great. He's, by the way, a guy with a kippah and tzitzis out. Right? He's like, USDA choice, central casting. And she's a Palestinian woman in a hijab. So they are both very traditional, different religions, different sides of the political divide. He says, but I never talked to her about politics. I said, why not? He goes, well, am I allowed to? I said, you can talk to her about anything you want to talk about. If she wants to talk about it, talk about it. So I see him on campus a couple weeks later, and I said, did you ever have that conversation with her? And he said, yeah, I did. I said, what's that face? I said to her, look, we've talked about all these little silly things just so I can learn vocabulary. We've never talked about the big issue. Are you willing to talk about it? She said, sure. I'll tell you my view, and then we can dig deeper if you want. One day you're going to be gone, and it's going to be ours. But in the meantime, I'm happy to be employed by your college. And he was devastated because he just said to himself, how many of the people that I actually know and like and know their husbands' names and know their kids' names, and we show each other pictures of our families on our phones, and that's what she thinks. How about all the other ones who wouldn't even step into Shalem College to have this conversation? So there's much more of that than I think a liberal Jewish American audience wants to acknowledge, or even than I want to admit.
We always have to be careful of anecdotal won cases?
100%. 100%. But if you look at those polls that are quoted in detail in the book, the polls show, again, numerous polls conducted by Palestinians, of Palestinians, more than half, are actually in favor of continuing the armed battle against Israel's existence, not about these borders. So it's very sad. It's very painful. It's a human tragedy.
I want to pivot to religion. You say on page 220, courage is the last word one would use to describe Israel's rabbinate. It is anti-intellectual. There's a little segment I'm skipping just for length. Untouched by modernity, misogynist, corrupt, and often morally vile.
Other than that,
so
it's
fine. So just talk about pluralism. How's that going in terms of what Israel is supposed to be? And just remind us, I know we don't have time for the really good kind of history background, but what was intended in terms of the ultra-Orthodox or Haredim?
Well, it depends, intended by whom?
Right.
Intended by the Haredim, probably something very close to what they got now. Although, by the way, not entirely, because they really never intended to play the political game. In other words, the state is fundamentally a violation of God's will. The Talmud says God made a deal between the nations and Israel. Basically, the nations, you guys are not allowed to torment the Jewish people too much. And the Jewish people, in exchange for that, you can't circle the hands of time quickly, and you have to wait for me to bring you back. That's why the Haredi world was so anti-Zionist. You're doing exactly what the Talmud said. Yeah. So they actually said, you're not waiting for God, we're opposed. And because we're opposed and you're fundamentally sinful, we will not be ministers in your governments. At the beginning, we won't even vote. Then they said, well, the men are going to vote, the women aren't going to vote, so the men should have 2 votes because they won't let their wives vote. That did not go very far. Now they've kind of begun to play the political game. They've understood that there's a lot of capital to be had by playing the political game. They will serve as ministers, they will serve as deputy ministers, and they have a tremendous amount of power. I mean, when Ben Gurion, in the early days of the state, allowed 400 men not to go to the army and to study in yeshiva, he did it because he thought, like, look at these people. I mean, how long can they possibly survive? This is the very last remnants of what happened in the Holocaust. What am I going to argue with them?
Let them do their thing.
Let them do their thing. They'll die out. And now look what we have. We have about 1 million, maybe more. So as far as they're concerned, things are going great. Now, if you look at Ben Gurion, it's the opposite of what he thought, because he thought religion was going to disappear entirely. Everybody looks at that picture of Ben Gurion on May 14th, 1948, reading out the thing with his hair, not wearing a kippah. That's not an accident. Even secular prime ministers in Israel, when they go to official events, they put on a kippah out of deference. Ben Gurion was going to show no deference to Jewish religious tradition. He was part of that Zionist tradition which said, the Jewish religion makes the Jewish people sick. We have to rid ourselves of it. He would be, I think, surprised, appalled, and bemused by the degree to which religion has infiltrated all sorts of nooks and crannies, but a lot of it in a great way. That's the part that doesn't make the press, because it's not juicy enough, but it's really fascinating. After 73, in the Yom Kippur War, there's a real break in the Israeli psyche. Because in 67, we were invulnerable. We were done. They would never attack us again.
That was the new Jew.
That was the new Jew. That was the new diplomatic reality. And then just 6 years go by, and we're just slaughtered. I mean, in 67, 700 guys died, but we triple our size. In 73, 3,000 guys die, and we claw our way back to where we started. I mean, a disaster. It had huge political impact that we won't talk about right now, but religiously, if I'm never going to be at peace here, then why am I here? And the only way to make an argument for why I'm here is to begin to go back to those books that tell the story of why I'm here. And it's the beginning of a crack. You know, Leonard Cohen says there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. That's how religion started to get in. People were searching for meaning. And that's about the same time, about 10 years earlier, but a decade later, the Mizrahim, who never bought the whole secular thing, even if they weren't personally orthodox, their reverence for tradition was, just throughout their lives. So the Bani brothers and uncles and nephews who took over the Israeli cultural scene with great voices and music. Yishai Ribo now, who is a kind of a very, very popular singer. Eti Ankri was once a completely secular Israeli Ashkenazi woman who became religious and started to sing the songs of Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gvirol, a medieval Jewish philosopher, poet. Religion has made its way back into Israel, and in a lot of those corners that don't make the news, there's a tremendous amount of pluralism. I mean, in my neighborhood alone, there's, I don't know how many synagogues that you would call sort of egalitarian Orthodox synagogues. Now, some of our listeners are going to say, so fine, well, if it's egalitarian, it's not Orthodox. Call it what you will. There's a mechitza, and some of them, these people are all punctiliously observant, but they're egalitarian. Some of them, there's not a mechitza. And people go from one to the other. Reformed communities come and visit, and they're welcomed. In other words, it's not all as ugly as I described the chief rabbinate as being, and it's not all as ugly as some of what we see in contemporary Israeli politics. There's a flowering of some really beautiful stuff in the Israeli religious scene. But the rabbinate itself, I don't take back a word of that. The rabbinate itself is anti-Zionist, by the way, in addition to everything else. Doesn't have a single day of secular education. Not a single day. So they don't know people like you. They don't know people like me. They don't have any idea what you learned in college. They don't have any idea what I learned in college.
But they're fine with that.
They're fine with it, but it creates a very narrow worldview, and it creates a certainty about the rightness of your way that once you get educated the way you got, or you get educated the way that I got educated, you kind of know you don't know the whole complexity of the human condition.
And you say there's also something at stake here for American Jews. I mean, for me, part of Central Synagogue, where there's 800 people on a Friday night praying, the idea that we are Holocaust deniers, essentially, and the other names that Reformed Jews have been called, it's just hard to swallow. And it's not that I'm going to stop going to Israel, but you do begin to sort of have kind of an emotional tether that gets worn away if you keep hearing that you're actually not a Jew. How much do you think it matters if, whether it's call so many of us conservative reform, some of us don't even use the labels, but if the language from kind of Israel's top brass is you actually don't count, what does that matter?
Well, it matters a lot, because we all know what it's like to be insulted. I mean, the insults that we remember most are the ones that people didn't even intended to be insulting, but we remember what our parents said to us when there was sort of a slip of the tongue, or what a friend in elementary school said. Insults dig deep. And when it's the chief rabbinate of the Jewish state saying those kinds of disgusting things, it's painful. And I've actually been astonished to meet people in all kinds of cities across America and Canada who will talk about the fact that their conversion, for example, is not accepted by the Israeli rabbinate. These are people that have zero intention of making Aliyah. Zero intention. So what do they care what the Israeli rabbinate says about their conversion? And they start to cry when they ask me the question. And I'm just touched by, wow, this really hurts people. It's disgusting. I mean, that's why I said what I said. But here's the flip side of it. The success of Israel matters to all of us in the following way. You go to Central Synagogue. If I'm in town here, I go somewhere else. I go to 5 different places in Israel, depending on what time of the week. It doesn't matter. All of us Jews, American Jews, Israeli Jews, Canadian Jews, French Jews, doesn't matter where, we tell a story in the 21st century of Judaism being a story of from destruction to rebirth. Michurban libinyan, from Holocaust to sovereignty. We are now in a world in which Israel has faced, and maybe still facing, an existential crisis, meaning its existence may actually not be certain. If God forbid, and I don't think it's going to happen, but I lay awake at night in bed many nights worrying about this, that's not an exaggeration. If Israel were to go down, not due to a foreign power, but just because we pulled ourselves apart and all the people who could leave left, and it became a second world country and a third world country before you know it, whatever, Central Synagogue also can't tell a story of from destruction to rebirth. And the Park Avenue Synagogue can't tell a story of destruction to rebirth, and KJ cannot tell that story either. It doesn't matter what denomination you are. We all feel, my God, we're living in this era of Jewish life where we came this close to the precipice, and look what we've built. And that's why I keep begging people, even though I know the rabbinate can be so offensive and so really vile in the way that it talks about people, you can't separate yourself from the state, and you can't give up on the state, because whether you can be hostile to the state, you can be whatever, but the minute you're unengaged, you're actually not part of the narrative that we all talk about, which is from destruction to rebirth. This is a huge part of our rebirth, and if God forbid it goes south in Israel, American Jewish life within a few decades looks very different. The life gets sucked out of the mechanism, and I feel we would have something very different here. So we're all in this together at a certain point.
You mentioned that there might be some who eventually leave if this kind of gets bad enough. When we roll back to Ben-Gurion's goal, if we're again testing what were some of the promises and the expectations, it was that more Jews were going to come. And you write very interestingly about how he was disappointed. Can you just talk about what was the plan? Was that, and how were they going to accommodate it, considering that there were food lines for even those who were there?
Right, reality and dreams don't always go hand in hand, but the dream was, like, if you were a Zionist in Ben-Gurion's day and you'd read the poetry of Bialik and you'd read Herzl and you talked about the pathetic, horrible, dysfunctional, disfiguring reality of Jewish life in Europe, well, if there's finally a Jewish state, I mean, well, of course you're going to come. I mean, the first time in 2,000 years there's a Jewish sovereignty, you're going to stay on the Upper East Side? I mean, like, show me the Upper East Side in the Bible. What are you possibly talking about? Now, I'm saying it with, obviously a bit of a chuckle, but from these guys, and they're mostly men, some women, and now, thankfully, lots of women in the system now, but back then it was unfortunately, overwhelmingly a male enterprise. They just couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe that nobody came. The only people, I mean, this is statistically a slight exaggeration, but it's fundamentally true. The only Jews that have come in any meaningful numbers to Israel in the last 75 years are the Jews who could not live decent Jewish lives where they were. Of course, some tens of thousands, whatever, Jews from America have come each year and all that, but it's a community of 6 million people. It's statistically, very, very negligible. And to Ben-Gurion, the idea that the only people who would come were the people that really couldn't stay where they were, and that the people that had a real choice to make would choose not to come, it was devastating for him. And he wrote in his diary, I always thought the problem was going to be finding a land for the Jewish people. I never thought I'd have to find Jewish people for the land. But look, let's just now fast forward. Ben-Gurion's not alive, obviously. There's 6 million Jews in America. Let's just be crazy for a second. Let's say 3 million of them came. It would completely tip the demographic scales. The battle that we're having between this government being, 50-50 would be a whole different ballgame. A Western, pluralist, differently educated kind of population would help us ignite this conversation, because people like me and you in Israel are now a minority. Ashkenazi Jews are a minority of the Jews in Israel. The Mizrahi Jews, who bring a rich religious tradition and a rich cultural tradition, but not a pluralist cultural tradition, they're the majority. If more American Jews and British Jews and Australian Jews and whatever came, Israel might be having a slightly different kind of conversation.
You also said that Ben-Gurion kind of alienated American Jewish leadership. And I'm quoting you, Ben-Gurion's stridency and autocratic personality caused a rupture in relations between Israel and American Jews. Can you just briefly tell the Jacob Blaustein story? Because I think that is quite telling. And it relates to the fact that Jews didn't want to go.
Right. So in the early years of the state, 48, 49, 50, 51, the head of the American Jewish Committee, which is at that point, the most important American Jewish organization.
No AIPAC.
No, AIPAC, and AJC is still a very important organization, right. But then it was the uncontested voice of American Jewry. It's then the lay head is a man named Jacob Blaustein, actually from Baltimore, my hometown. And Ben-Gurion would come and he would say two things. Number one, there's a new center of the Jewish world. It's called Israel, and you should all come to it. So Blaustein would say to him, sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, there's more Jews in New York City than in your entire state. What are you talking about, new center of the Jewish world? What exactly does that even mean? And second of all, we're Americans. Don't come here and tell us that we should make Aliyah. Don't forget, American Jews are fighting very hard to be accepted in America. 1952 is not 2023. I mean, 2023 is not really 2015. But back in 2015 or 2010, when it was before the uprising in anti-Semitism here, when Jews are feeling every bit as American as anybody else, that wasn't the case in 1952. Jacob Blaustein is keenly aware of the fact that American Jews are still going to have to sort of fight to be accepted. And so he says to Ben-Gurion, just cut this out. Stop talking about a new center of the Jewish world. You're not the center of the Jewish world. And stop talking about Aliyah, because we're not coming. We're not coming because this is our home. Get that into your head. And he said, if you don't stop it, we are going to cease financial support and diplomatic support. And there's a very famous agreement, the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement, which I think both sides violated very, very often. But the agreement was American Jews will continue to support Israel, and Israel will stop asking American Jews to make Aliyah. But Israeli Jews do feel that it's the center of the Jewish world. And by the way, now, statistically, it is the world's largest Jewish community, and in about 10, 15 years, it'll be the majority of the world's Jews. So what Ben-Gurion was saying in 52 may have been outrageous, but 80 years after he said it, not entirely crazy, but still offensive to American Jews who rightly say there's a thriving Jewish community here. It has all kinds of challenges, but don't denigrate it. And Israeli Jews don't want to denigrate it, I don't think most do at least, but they are puzzled by the fact that for the first time in 2,000 years, there's this opportunity to build this thing. And really the only people that have come overwhelmingly are the ones who came from lands where they couldn't stay.
So finally, Danny, you say one cannot begin to understand the soul of the state of Israel without appreciating the fact that for many, embrace of Zionism was born of tear-rinsed lives. Jews yearned for a home of their own because their welcome everywhere else always ran out. When you look at the number of young American Jews now who don't have that kind of sensorial or even psychological memory and just see kind of a mess, let's just have shorthand about it. They are uncomfortable with the way Palestinians' lives are. They are uncomfortable with it being done in their name as Jews. They're seeing, the protests, and maybe they're inspired by it, but they're confused by what's going on in terms of, judicial reform. And they just go, how do you just, again, when you look at this book and your investment is so unquestioned, but for those who maybe don't have those connections and they don't have that bedrock feeling, what are your words for them?
First of all, I understand it. I really do understand it. It's interesting, we're on 46th Street, and as I was walking here from the 30s, there was a big sign in Times Square, one of those little, gigantic illuminated signs, and it said American Jews are 2% of American population, and they're the victims of 55% of religious, attacks or whatever, hate crimes. So just funny that you mention it. I'm not sure how far we are from tear-rinsed becoming understandable again, tragically. I don't think, God forbid, anything massive, but it's a different world than it was when I was growing up and you were growing up. So the first thing I would say is I understand. I understand that if I was a young American Jew, especially, but any kind of American Jew, but especially if I was young, and I see what's going on, I can find it very distasteful. And I don't want to deny any of that. I want to put that right where it is and give it its place and honor it. At the same time, what I want to say is partly the problem is that Israel's been so unbelievably successful in changing the existential condition of the Jew that you don't realize how much your life and your existential condition is the product of a state that you're now no longer sure you see the need for. That's one irony. The other irony is not an irony, but it's sad. The Palestinian story isn't the story of Israel any more than race is the story of America. In other words, race is a huge part of America. It's not the only thing about America, though. And if you don't know about race, then you don't know about America. But if you know only race, you also don't know about America. You don't know about the greatness of all sorts of other things that have happened here. And in Israel, I would say the flowering of Jewish culture, the flowering of literature, the explosion of a new Jewish sensibility about being the determiners of our own fate and the charters of our own destiny, and the builders of our own schools, and world-class healthcare, and being on the forefront of a technological revolution, and just changing the world and our own lives in so many ways. I think life is about balance. And I think life is about saying, yes, this Palestinian issue, or the way that the rabbinate talks about non-Orthodox Jews, which we spoke about earlier, is hugely painful. And I'm not going to let that slide, and I'm not going to ignore that. But I also don't want to ignore the degree to which the Jewish state has fundamentally changed the lives of the Jewish people everywhere on the planet. And my challenge as a thoughtful, nuanced person is to fight like hell against the parts of the Israeli reality that I don't like or that offend me, and to embrace the rest of it in a way that makes it clear to the world that despite my discomfort with many things about it, I understand its importance to the future of the Jewish people. I know that most people aren't there. I know that most people probably won't get there, but if you ask me what would I say to them, that's what I'd say.
Daniel Gordis, thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
For this book and this conversation. The book is Impossible Takes Longer. I hope you will engage it and have hard conversations around it, and it has history that we all should remember. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. Thank you for joining us.